Hi, my name is Ron Hill, and I'm in the Villanova School of Business. And I'm going to talk to you about poverty today. Now, you might stop and ask, why would a business professor be an expert in poverty? I mean, I've had reviewers of my research say to me, why are you writing about poverty in a business school? Because the poor don't buy, we don't care about them. But something happened to me 25 years ago that I'll never forget. Like most young scholars, I was trying to write and trying to get tenure at a university. Either that or I'd lose my job. And so I worked as hard as I could, literally 7 days a week, trying to get the writing to work. And finally, after 4 years, I got some things accepted in very good journals. I began to feel better about myself. And I got an opportunity to go to Cornell University as a visiting professor in their graduate school. I felt like I was moving on up, and it was going to be good times for everybody. So I got to Cornell University, and it was in the late 80s, and I was talking to a group of students about the AIDS crisis. And I said to them, you know, this could change the way business does things. We talked about sexual practices and sexual proclivities for the very first time in a business school, and using that as ways in which we might market products. It was one of those lectures where you feel very good about yourself. You go back kind of self-satisfied to your office. You sit back. If I'd had a pipe at the time, I would have smoked it. Okay? And I'm sitting back in my office, and all of a sudden I get a knock on the door, and I open it thinking, here come another student to talk to me about it. A young man, 25 years of age, puts his arms around me, puts his head in my chest, and starts crying. He told me he found out that day he had AIDS. Now, in the 1980s, that was a death sentence for sure. And I looked at a beautiful, handsome, intelligent, capable young man with a death sentence. And I had just been out there talking to them as if this were some kind of theoretical or conceptual debate about what was going to happen. I was knocked over. As a professor, it was one of the very first times where I felt, oh my, what am I doing here? And I went to my wife, and I talked to my friends, and I said, if I'm going to continue to do this kind of work, I'm going to have to be with the people I'm talking about so that I'm talking about them from their strengths, not from my conceptual background. And I made the decision to talk about poverty. Now, it wasn't a very popular topic, but I will tell you, 25 years later, it's worked out just fine. It's worked out just fine because I've gotten an opportunity to do work that keeps me stimulated this much later. I want to get to my research, but it's this young man who gave me the opportunity to recognize when I do my research, I want to do it because it helps people around the world. Now I'm going to ask you to imagine poverty, but I'm going to ask you to imagine poverty maybe differently than you might understand. Over 25 years, I've done dozens of studies and published, well, way too many papers to tell you. But I will tell you about 3 studies that I've conducted fairly recently with a variety of colleagues that shows that people that live in poverty are different than those of us fortunate enough to listen to this TED Talk or sit in this audience. Study number 1, done in a large metropolitan area, you can guess. We took very impoverished children where the average home value was about $30,000, and we juxtaposed them against children who live in homes that are valued at about $1 million. Now, the reason I wanted to do this study is I had a colleague, Lon Chaplin, who's now at University of Illinois, and her mentor, Debbie Roederjohn at University of Minnesota. They asked me, are impoverished children different in the way in which they relate to the material world? And I said, yes, they are. They said, how do you know that? And I said, well, over the years I've kind of figured it out, but let's do a study. So Lon Chaplin has this amazing study that she does where she looks at whether or not young children value material things as much as or potentially more than the things that we think should give value, relationships and other things. And she found with her colleagues that over time, when young children go into puberty, guess what happens? They become much less confident, they become clingy to things and hope it'll give them self-esteem. We all know the social tiering that goes on in middle school, We all probably realized that if we could have skipped that time, we would have all been better off. Okay? But what happens when they go into high school, and particularly later high school, they begin to shift. That the children they had studied over time, they start getting good grades, they start thinking about college, you have extracurricular activities, all these things that give them opportunities to grow. And so materialism actually drops off. She said, do you think that'll happen in the places that we're going to look? And I said, well, let's take a look. Two interesting findings. One was that impoverished children were more materialistic at every stage than those from more affluent communities. It seems like those least able to afford things desire them the most. Secondly, the impoverished children, when we got to that place where the affluent children started to tail off, they actually went a straight line across. They didn't decrease. And we asked ourselves why. Well, you don't have to go very far to figure it out. In this affluent community, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of opportunities to build esteem. All kinds of extracurricular activities that either involved in their school systems or from their parents. Great school opportunities, great grade opportunities. The impoverished kids, many, if not most of the kids in their schools don't complete high school, and many fewer end up in college. They've increased the class size by 50%, and the only thing new coming into some of these schools have been metal detectors. So what do you expect to happen over time? All right, study number one. Study number two, we went global with this baby. You know, we wanted to really see what's happening globally because we recognize that the poor has a very global face. So what we did was we took wealthy nations like the United States, Canada, Germany, and we juxtaposed those against very poor nations in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And we asked ourselves, how do they relate to their material world? Now, what we wanted to look at was whether people were satisfied or less satisfied depending upon their availability of material things. So guess what? If you live in a really poor nation, you're much less satisfied with your life. Big shock, right? We know that people who have more access to things, that gives them an opportunity to grow in their lives in lots of ways we don't think about. But what was most interesting to us is we juxtaposed the haves versus the have-nots in both types of nations. So, in the United States, the haves, who can look down the material food chain at the have-nots, guess what? The haves are more satisfied with their lives than the have-nots. Same thing happens in impoverished nations, but the difference in impoverished nations is even larger. The gap in life satisfaction even larger in impoverished nations than it is in affluent nations. And we were taken aback by that. Our exploration led us to this fairly simple conclusion that the difference between having a Honda Accord and a Mercedes-Benz is much less than having one farm animal and three. Study number three, and I think it'll bring it all together for you. At least it did for me. Study number three. We looked at saving behavior. Now, many of you might know that in the United States, most people dis-save. I remember when I went into a car dealership and they said I had negative equity in my car. Any of you face that? I said, no, that's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Okay, you dis-save. It doesn't mean you dis-saving. It means you spend more than you have access to. Now, we can go into how that can occur and how it can occur over time, but that's most of the United States. The answer to why people do that is they're trying to get into the material game in a way in which is culturally appropriate for them. So we asked ourselves, well, is that different in impoverished nations? Clearly it is. So we thought, they are going to save even less, right? Wouldn't you expect that? I mean, here you are in the United States and you don't have a lot, but you're in Sub-Saharan Africa? Aren't you in the precipice of actually not surviving? So we looked, and guess what we found? We found that the poorest of the poor save more than the poorest in wealthy nations. Why is that? How do they do that? How do you eke out something of $2.50 a day? How do you do that? Well, what we found was they recognized something that many of us don't know. Given the government could come in anytime and sweep away the slum, given the vagaries of their health and the inability to work sometimes, given the difficulties associated with an informal economy, they cannot afford not to have something in situations where there are downsides to their jobs. And so they save. All right, this is only 3 studies. And the reason for them is just to give you an idea that the world is probably different than you might have expected it to be. And we have many more indications of that. But I want to have you go away with 4 thoughts. And I always hate putting up a number like 4, because if I get to 3 and I don't get to 4, you're going to say, wait a second, I'm counting. Okay? So keep me honest here. The first one is, I'm going to ask you to suspend judgment. It actually will help you, because don't you judge yourselves all the time? I know I do. And I'm not very nice about it either. Like right now, I should be nicer to myself right now. And I'm not being particularly nice. So suspend judgment. I had a student one time when I was giving a lecture on impoverishment in a leadership course. He said, I don't care. I'm not like those people. If I had to work at a low-level service job, I would do that. And I said, okay, I'm hearing judgment. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to quit your job for 6 months and go to work in McDonald's. Because it's an empirical question. Prove to me that you would do that. And he thought for a minute, and then he said, well, that wouldn't be fair to my family. And I went, okay, you're right. Go to work part-time at McDonald's on nights and weekends for 6 months to prove it. That was the end of the conversation. It's so much easier to judge people. We do it all the time. You look around. But guess what? The pterodactyl is not coming for us. We can suspend these kind of judgments and actually be better people to ourselves and to everybody else. Second, I want you to learn. Now, I know I've just given you an inkling about what poverty is like, but really learn. Do you know that there are 1 billion children in the world today living in abject poverty? And millions of them die every year from preventable diseases. Do you know that there are hundreds of millions of people living in shanty towns who are homeless by most of our standards? And that same number lacks access to safe water. That in 70% of the world, the difference between the haves and have-nots is growing, not shrinking. Okay. Maybe you'll say to yourself, those numbers are too big for me to do anything about. But at least you can have a conversation about what poverty is if you take the time to learn about it. Number 3. So I've made it this far, right? Number 3, get proximal. I work with a gentleman named William Goolsbee at Reconstruction Inc. in North Philadelphia. And he said to me over and over again, Ron, I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing, but I want you to come down here and meet the people that you're actually serving. We had Brian Stevenson here. He wrote the book Just Mercy. If you haven't read it, you should. And he talks about getting proximal. And he told a group of students here at Villanova last spring, it's not enough to care. You've got to also do something about it. And you'll do something about it, be more likely to do something about it if you get proximal. I worked when I was in Portland, Oregon. I was a dean of a business school, and I was on a committee where we were going to solve the homelessness problem in our city. We had 1,500 children, and by that I mean 12 to 18-year-old youths, selling themselves on the street, panhandling, doing drugs, selling drugs. We had some of them dying of black tar heroin. It was a giant problem. They pulled together a group of about 25 people, including myself, to say, let's come up with a solution. About 10 of the people in the room said, here's a solution, get them the heck off the streets, and that's the solution. But the person who was running it for the state and for the city said, Well, before we make those decisions, why don't we bring some of those kids here and have you meet them? And they literally made sure that every one of those people sat next to somebody who was suffering from this homelessness. Guess what happened the next week? Everybody said, we got to do something to help these children. Get proximal. Look in the face of somebody who's impoverished and get to know them. And you will find the humanity in them and the humanity in yourself. Number 4. I got there, thank you very much. I know you were counting. I can see it in your eyes. You're counting out there. Number 4, we can't do anything unless we get politically active. The great American philosopher Jim Wetzel, who's the Augustinian chair here at Villanova University, has told business students for the last 5 years 2 important things about the way in which they live. One is you're living in fear. We have the politics of fear that dominate everything. 2, they believe the world is about scarcity, not abundance. So they do 2 things. They fear what they don't understand, and they hoard things thinking that that will make them more secure somehow. The truth is, we live in a world of great abundance. Take a fraction of what we spend on armament, and we could solve the whole problem of poverty worldwide tomorrow. It wouldn't be easy. Implementing the ideas would be difficult, but we could do it. But we don't have the political will, in part because we spend so much time, at least in the United States, worried and fearful of those things that we don't understand. What we need to make sure is that the politicians who serve us in a variety of capacities stop and think deeply about how to make a better world, how to reduce poverty, our obligations to people. Just because you're a human being, you should have the right to food, health care, clothing, shelter, and education, just because you're a human being. No other reason. So I asked you to imagine what poverty looks like. Hopefully you have. Now I'm going to ask you to imagine what a world without poverty might look like. And let's make that our goal. Thank you very much.